This podcast is part of the Batman Universe Podcast Network, hosted by the BatmanUniverse.net. Check out everything related to Batman and the entire Bat family at the BatmanUniverse.net, including news and original content related to comics, movies, television, merchandise, video games, and more. Also, check out some of the other unique podcasts that TBU has to offer. Consider supporting this podcast by becoming a patron on Patreon. Even $1 can go a long way in supporting this content that you enjoy. Look for a link over at the BatmanUniverse.net to offer your support now. And now, on with the show.
In 2008, a podcast was created with one goal: to bring Bat fans around the world news related to movies, comics, video games, television, merchandise, and so much more. And now, the Batman Universe Podcast has returned.
Hello everyone and welcome to the latest episode of the TBU Podcast. Joining me today is BJ and Scott, and today we have something that we mentioned in a past episode that we were going to do, but we decided to move it up. First off, obviously last week we did not have an episode. That was mostly because the episode would have released right before the 4th of July, and quite honestly, we all know that everybody's got their own plans when it comes to summer and things like that, so we figured we would hold off on an episode that specific week, but we're back this week, and specifically we are talking about Batman Returns. We are going to be kind of doing not so much like a... See, if you're a long-time TBU listener, you probably already know that we've done a commentary. It's available on a separate feed called TBU Commentaries. You can find it on Apple and all the other podcast platforms. But we did one like ages ago. Like, I'm talking a very long time ago, probably a solid 12 years or more ago kind of situation. And at the time, it is what it is. And as you grow as a Bat fan and as you absorb more content, you go to appreciate things that you might not have appreciated before. And I think Batman Returns, while it's obviously not lauded compared to, let's say, Batman and Robin or to a degree Batman Forever, there are people who do not find Batman Returns as good as Batman 1989 or the Dark Knight trilogy, or obviously more recently with The Batman. But there's still a lot of really great things to appreciate. And this year, specifically in the month of June, the film is celebrating its 30th anniversary when it first released in theaters. So we wanted to kind of do like a retrospect and talk about a variety of different things from the film. So, as usual, when it comes to one of these things, I typically pass it off to Scott because he does a great job prepping for this, and I unfortunately don't have the ability to do that. So, Scott, what do we have in store for Batman Returns?
The way I have this set up is, I'm going to start off with a question, and then we'll talk about special effects a little bit, favorite moments, and then go into the individual characters, and then come together into what we think the movie's about. And at the very end, I have an extra question about one of the very minor characters that I know BJ and I have often joked about. But we'll get to that. So I'll dive right in. I'm going to start off. We did do an episode, a while back about whether or not we thought this was a Christmas movie. You can listen to that episode, and it was a pretty fun one. But I'm going to start off by asking the question, is it weird to release a Christmas movie in June where said, quote, Christmas movie, unquote, starts with Pee Wee Herman and his wife abandoning their deformed son in a river in kind of a Moses vibes kind of way?
So it's interesting because this isn't the only movie this happens in. And honestly, we can look at The Batman and say that film literally was Halloween night and it released in March. And obviously they had planned on it releasing at a different point in time in the year. Regardless, it happened when it did, and it's just amusing that it all, things like that always, end up working out the way they do. The Batgirl film is supposed to be taking place around the Christmas season or the holiday season, and who knows if that movie's actually going to be hitting theaters or HBO Max, whatever they're going to end up doing with that film around Christmas. Is it weird to have a filming in June for Christmas? No, and I think the reason why is because, at least here in America, when you think of Christmas, or at least most people think of Christmas, you think of snow, you think of, tons of decorations and things like that. But I think that there's a lot of places, if you're not from the Midwest or the Northeast or certain parts of the Northwest, I don't really think that idea of Christmas is a real thing when it comes to the vast majority of America. If you live in the South or you live in the West, you don't have snow. You don't have, there's decorations and such, but it's very different portrayal. And I think I grew up in the Midwest, and I always just I associated snow with Christmas. And then as I got older, I realized how little it actually is snowing during Christmas. So I think in the larger scheme of things, to answer your question, I don't think it's too weird to do that. I think that if you're, whether or not it's a Christmas movie can be obviously heavily debated, and we've done that before. But I think that if you look at it from the idea of it not necessarily being a Christmas film, but it being a film that takes place during that season, I don't think it's that strange. Now, it'd be different if it was a film that was strictly about Christmas, like, some of the famous movies like Home Alone or A Christmas Story or National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation. Those films those would be weird to come out in that time frame of June. But for this film, it just happens to have the setting of that time of the year, so I think it's okay for it to be released in June.
Yeah, I don't think it's strange to have it be a Christmas movie in June, but it's obviously strange to throw at the baby in the first scene of the movie. But that's Tim Burton. I'm sure we'll go all into the Burtonisms. But I'm sure, Scott, that you kind of were wishing it was Christmas, watching it in middle of summer. I'm sure it's warm wherever you are.
Yeah, it was pretty hot today, and I did brush up on it again today. But yeah, it's just something I noticed because, going back to the opening with baby penguin being dumped into the river, it seems like, and then throughout the movie, it seems like, the plot and the structure is everything that's kind of the antithesis of what we would think about in the Christmas season. So I assume the June thing is also partly because that's when the previous one was released, was in June at some point. So they're just continuing with the same dates, just like Star Wars likes, or used to like, May releases. But before we get into favorite moments, something that jumped out at me, and I feel like it surprises me every time I watch this because I forget about it, is that the penguin makeup. Like, I really like Penguin's design in here, but I always forget that it's done by Stan Winston, and that's interesting because, he's arguably one of the most famous special effects, costume design, makeup people in the business. Some of his more prestigious work has been the original Jurassic Park. He designed the Predator. He did special effects for the Terminator and The Thing. So, it's interesting that here he is working on a Batman movie, and his work, naturally enough really leans into the gothic horror aesthetic that Tim Burton also really leans into in this movie over the previous Tim Burton Batman film.
I will say I'm not as huge of a fan of the overall design of Penguin, but I can appreciate that there was a good chunk of work, and the fact that based off of that gothic horror atmosphere that Tim Burton kind of like placed the movie in, it works within the confines of the movie. Is it my favorite version of the character? Certainly not. Honestly, whenever I see a comic artist kind of make their version of the character based off of the Batman Returns version of Penguin, I kind of get annoyed. But that's not to say that I can't appreciate it. I think the part of the film that disturbs me, disturbs is probably a strong way of putting it, but like the part that is so off-putting, I will say, is the part where he's got the black goo coming out of his mouth. It's just, I don't understand it. I mean, I understand that he's supposed to be, some sort of deformed child or whatever, and, he's deformed, and whatever. He has his own set of issues, and to the point where his parents get rid of him and throw him into a river. But the thing is, I don't understand the black goo. I know I've mentioned this before when we've talked about the film, but I don't understand the point of the black goo. I'm not sure if that was intended, if that's something that Stan Winston worked on or not. But when you look at it within the confines of the gothic horror film, I think the version of the character works. I just don't want to see it spread out and become something that affects other, points of medium when it comes to the Penguin.
Yeah, for that design of Penguin where he's got flippers for hands, that was our design for Penguin in the animated series. Obviously less gross and less goo everywhere. He was more of a gentleman in the animated series, but it was definitely a different take on the Penguin where he was a deformed mutant than we've seen in the past. And he had his rubber ducky toy. I love the rubber ducky vehicle. I know there's a Funko coming out about that. I'm going to have to try to pick that up. But it's definitely a unique Penguin that we'll probably never see that version again, really, in live action.
Yeah, probably not. I mean, it probably would be a little dated though too to drag that up. It's kind of of its own era and its own, unique spot, I guess, in film. But on that note, watching it again, what are your favorite moments from the movie?
So one of my favorite moments, it has to do more with kind of the overarching romantic element of the film. When you watch Batman 1989, Vicky Vale exists, but I don't really feel like there's any real chemistry there. I feel like Bruce is smitten with her, she's smitten with the idea of Batman, and that's the extent of how they come to be. Regardless of how it ends up at the end of the film, it's not very strong when it comes to that element between them. But with this film, I think one of the strongest things in the film is the Selina and Bruce element. It does a great job by itself, but then I think by far my favorite moment of the film is actually at the end when Batman takes his he rips his mask off in the power area where there's the electricity and such, and he basically says to Catwoman like she has the ability to be good, and that I like that moment. It says leaps and bounds what those two characters are and who they are outside of just film. It's like I was just complaining about how I'm not a huge fan of this version of Penguin in the film, but when it comes to the relationship that's shown between Selina and Bruce, I think the film does a great job. Honestly, I would put it right on par with what we just saw with the Batman with Selina and Bruce, but even more because Bruce isn't really the character that Selina's dealing with. She's more dealing with Batman. But like when you compare it to, let's say, Selina and Bruce or Batman and Catwoman in The Dark Knight Rises, it's nowhere near as good. I think Batman Returns is just far superior when it comes to that romantic side of it. And when you look at just the other films in general of the relationships that Bruce has had in film, I think that honestly the Selina Bruce relationship or Catwoman and Batman relationship in Batman Returns is honestly one of the best we've seen out of all the live action films. I put it leaps and bounds above Vicky Vale in Batman 1989. When it comes to Batman Forever and Chase Meridian, sorry, she's just obsessed with him, and she wants to get close. There's no even point of mentioning the love interest in Batman Robin. The Rachel Dawes stuff, like to a degree, there's something there, but it feels like Bruce is like latching onto something from his past, and it's just not something that's actually there for him to get any sort of reciprocation from. So I think ultimately I feel like Batman Returns does a great job, and then the Batman is very, right there when it comes to the relationship side of stuff. And, it's funny when you think about an action film or a superhero film, you're probably going to think about the characters, and you're probably going to think about, the villains and the action and the plot and all that. But honestly, when I look at Batman Returns, my favorite aspect is that relationship between them, and I think that there was a lot of really good chemistry between Michael Keaton and Michelle Pfeiffer.
Yeah, I got a couple favorite moments there, small moments, but at the beginning when the Red Triangle Circus Gang attacks and they flip on the bat signal, and it cuts to Bruce Wayne in his study or whatever, just sitting there thinking, and the signal reflects off whatever he's built around the manor, and it cuts to him, and the light hits his face, and the music swells. I hope we see a little return of those reflectors in Batgirl or the Flash. Just a little small callback. And that whole scene when he takes out the Triangle Circus Gang is pretty cool. You can see he really never gets out of his car, and he still kind of saves the day. And I also like the scene at the end before Batman confronts Shrek and Catwoman, when he fires down his grapple and connects it to his belt, and he opens the cape up and swoops on down. It's just classic Batman.
So I want to get back to the relationship in a minute, but I also put down for my favorite moments the first two Red Triangle Gang attacks. I just kind of lumped them together. And to piggyback off of what you're saying, like that scene where, Bruce is in his study and the light hits, or the signal light reflects, and, he stands up and everything. I loved that, and the whole, the first attack, the music is really like sinister and eerie, kind of like warbled clown music, and it's, once you see Batman, it's just like sweeping heroic music. And, it's interesting because they're having this Christmas celebration. They're going to do the lighting of the tree, and it turns into this gang of clowns literally holding everyone hostage and burning stores and people alive. And something I noticed in watching this is Batman in this scene and in the second attack encounter with them, he's very low effort. Like you said, he uses his Batmobile to take out, most of the clowns. He doesn't get out. He just hits a button here or flips a switch there. He roasts the fire breather, and it's interesting because I feel like in the earlier part of this film, Batman is kind of introduced as more of like a godlike savior who barely has to lift a finger, and it's kind of opposed to like 1989 where his intro was more of an avenging a murder, a serious crime, and in this one he's just quelling like an inconvenient riot, and it carries over into his second encounter where he's pretty calm. He dodges the fights when he needs to, and he relies on his like special batarang, and that's also the moment where he puts a bomb on a guy's chest and dumps him into a well, and I mention these things because it's, Batman's, stopping the bad guys, but it's done in a way that really like amplifies, how powerful and overwhelming of a force he is. And it's not until he encounters Catwoman and Penguin do we ever really see Batman struggle. So I thought that was really interesting. I don't know if you guys have any more thoughts on that interpretation of Batman before we jump back to Catwoman, but feel free.
It's funny that you guys mention the red. It's funny you mentioned the Red Triangle Gang because for those comic book readers out there, they literally just made their first in-continuity appearance in the pages of Robin number 15 just this past month, actually. So, I mean, I feel like there is definitely a connection with the fact that the comic happened to release in the month of June alongside the 30th anniversary of the film. But I just thought that was an interesting fact just because I remember seeing something about it recently and thinking that is too much of a coincidence for it to be not something that was on purpose. So
it's funny too how it's a circus gang, the Red Triangle Circus Gang, but no one in the movie makes a mention of more clowns attacking Gotham, and it shows how far we've come. Where now everything has to be connected, there has to be callbacks, and even in the sequel, they don't even mention a Joker or anything.
It's funny too you say that because in the Batman '89 comic book that's been running on right now, it's not the Red Triangle Gang or anything, but Gotham City is just so used to of people dressing up as clowns to like cause riots and like destruction. It's just, I guess, in that universe and in that confines, it's just like an ordinary day for the citizens of Gotham. But circling back to that relationship, I wanted to talk about Catwoman for a little bit, and her character, because like I feel like that relationship between Selina and Bruce Wayne is super strong, but I also feel like Selina Kyle is really kind of the anchor in this movie, and I say that because after the prologue with Penguin being born, the first introduction we have to Gotham City is through Selina Kyle. We see her at work working for Max Schreck, and his name is borrowed from the actor who played the vampire in the original Nosferatu silent film. And basically, everything's black and gray, and it's very, Art Deco and Gothic at the same time. And, the scene that introduces us to Selina is, Max Schreck and some other company people are talking, and she's listening in. She offers a suggestion, and they all kind of stare at her until Max says, that Selina hasn't been properly housebroken yet. But in the plus column, she makes one hell of a cup of coffee. And it's a cat pun, but, it also tells us that Selina, is out of sync with this world. Everything around her is these shades of black and gray, and here she is in like a beige suit making coffee, and she has blonde hair too, which is also kind of in contrast to like the coloring of this movie. And so I feel like, right from the start, she's kind of the anchor and the champion we're supposed to focus on. It's a Batman movie, but really it's like, in my opinion, Selina Kyle's the heart, and in a sense too, where she's kind of like a champion for like people who don't feel at home with the world, and very much like a Tim Burton character. If you think about like Edward Scissorhands or Ed Wood, or you can even go back to Pee-wee's Big Adventure, where it's this weird like character who doesn't quite fit.
I agree completely with that, and it's funny because when you think about it, there's always a character in Tim Burton's films that is like that. In a lot of, or at least maybe not every single one of them, but a lot of his films have somebody like that, where it's like not the person you're expected to root for, but you end up rooting for them because you understand that they've got their own issues that make them unique and different to everyone else, but that doesn't make it any less important of the stuff that they're dealing with. So Selina is, like I said earlier, I mean, she's by far one of my favorite characters out of the, all of the, 4 films from 89 to Batman and Robin. She's by far one of my favorite characters of all of those films.
Yeah, their relationship is definitely, the Bruce Wayne Selina Kyle relationship's way better than Bruce and Vicky, and that scene at the masquerade party, where that's just a great scene when they're talking without they're not wearing their masks, and everybody else is wearing a mask, but they're wearing their real masks, which is their face, because their real person is Batman and Catwoman. That's just a great scene.
Yeah, I love that scene. It's just it kind of like everything comes to a head there, where Bruce, or I guess Batman's arc is, I guess we'll talk on that, but Selina Kyle's story up until that point is someone who's kind of beaten down by the world. Like when she's at her apartment, her answering machine is even kind of abusing her because it's negative messages from her mother and her soon-to-be ex-boyfriend. And it's, her whole thread line up until that point was like basically getting revenge, kind of asserting herself as like this new transformed person and getting revenge. So it's kind of interesting. But what do you guys think about like Batman's arc? Do you think he has one?
It's funny with Batman because Batman doesn't really feel like the focus in either sense. You've got Penguin on one side and you've got Catwoman on the other, and they've got great character arcs in this one. And Batman's just kind of like along for the ride. Yeah, he plays into the film, but he plays into their stories. It's not really a Batman story in a lot of regard, other than he is a character in the film that is focused on. But Penguin gets a lot of the focus, Catwoman gets a lot of the focus, and Batman's just kind of there. And it's it's different than what you expect from a typical Batman film, because most of the time you're following everything from his perspective. That's what you see, and there's an occasional scene here or there that lends into what's happening with the villain or another character that's important to the plot. But with this film, it really does feel like Batman is the supporting character in the film.
Yeah, he really doesn't have an arc. He kind of sits around and he's very reacting to everything. One of my favorite tidbits of the film is when they expose Penguin as the main bad guy at that speech with Shrek, and they got the CDs and they're scratching the CDs, and Penguin loses it and he opens fire on the crowd and then runs away. And Batman really kind of does nothing. He just stays in the cave. Like, you'd think he would go out and do anything, but I don't know. That's always been one of my favorite little nitpicks in that. But yeah, he kind of just mopes around. I think recently, or in years past, like they've talked, like Keaton talked about, like why he's not really in Batman Returns a lot, and they say it's like, oh, well, he's a mystery. He's a mystery character. You don't want him in there. You want him coming up out of nowhere. But it seems kind of a retcon. Like, it's Batman. Like, we want to see Batman. We don't want to see, all the random stuff that happened in this movie.
It's kind of funny too, because like that whole scene, he was framing Penguin, and I guess you could say if there was any like inkling of an arc, that they didn't follow through with, is when Batman's framed, and he has his little like getaway from the police. But after that sequence, it's not dealt with again. He just like, reveals some dirt from Penguin, and then problem solved. But it's interesting.
He says, "I'm good."
It's interesting you point that he just hangs out at his cave, because now I'm reminded of in 1989 when he gets Vicky Vale drunk and they just sleep together, and it's like, well, Batman took the night off because Vicky Vale was over. What about the Penguin? Like, other than the design and his grotesqueness, do you guys feel like, what do you think his story was? Because I think, like, before we like get like too far into it, I feel like there's a way Penguin's portrayed for like 90% of the film, and then like at the very end there's like this weird switch they do. So I don't know how I feel about him, but I'm curious how you guys do.
Yeah, so put aside his appearance and things like that and this version of the character, it is kind of strange because you're kind of built up to think that not so much that he's a villain, but you can tell he's a villain, but not like in the he's doing horrible, evil things. It really, to a degree, there's a level of like he's trying to feel accepted, and he feels as if he was thrown away, and this is his chance for redemption in a lot of ways. But you can tell that there's like obviously some underlying aspects of his plan that are trying to be villainous, as the easiest way to put it. But I think that by the end of it, I don't know that I feel like this, but I think there are some people who would feel sorry for him because he really just was trying to, like he was different. He had no control over the fact that he was born differently. He had no control over the fact that his parents, abandoned him. But he, in some ways, tried to make the best of it. He created a group that may have done bad things for the wrong reasons and things like that. But he surrounded himself with people who accepted him, and then he decided that he wanted to be accepted by the larger general audience of Gotham City and things like that. And I think there's a reason, you in your notes you mentioned that at the very end, the music is sympathetic and sad, and it's true, because I think by that point you understand that maybe him dying, or maybe the situation that how everything landed was not exactly great for him. I mean, he's not the character that you're rooting for. Selina is definitely that character in this film, but you don't feel like, I don't know, like I think about that sequence when he died and the penguins carry him off into the water, and I'm thinking that is kind of sad. I mean, like, I don't like the guy, and I don't really like this version of the character, but it's kind of sad how that all ends up playing out.
You could tell that Dan DeVito's having a great time with the being the Penguin, and
it's true.
chewing up the scenery. He has the great line, one of the best lines in Batman movie history, where he says, "I was born number one, but they treated me like number two." And I can't believe that's a line in a Batman movie, but it is. And
yeah, it's interesting because I kind of grapple back and forth. As you're probably looking through my notes as I'm watching the movie, I'm writing all these things down because, like, in the beginning, Bruce Wayne's like reading articles about the Red Triangle Gang and all these circus performers and this aquatic bird boy and all that, and he, is telling Alfred what he thinks Penguin knows and doesn't know, and we see that confirmed in the movie. Like, Penguin knows who his parents are. Next scene, Penguin goes to the cemetery and reveals them, and I took that early on as like a cue that like Penguin's very manipulative and he's a performer and everything's performative, and I feel like the movie wants you to feel like, for a lot of it, Penguin is like some kind of master manipulator, and like he's definitely hard to like. He bites that dude's face. He wants to kill the firstborn children of Gotham. And it's very difficult to be sympathetic towards him. But like you say, that ending, it's the Penguins dragging him out. It's sad, and maybe Penguin's a monster, and he was brought out into the light by even more of a monster, a more powerful monster who just had the same singular focus of like amassing more power. And maybe, it's good that he's gone, but also like this idea that he was born bad and he never had a chance, and that's why there's some sort of sympathy. I don't know. But I feel like it's very complicated.
I agree.
As far as like what to make of the movie as a whole, I would ask this question, what do you think this movie's about?
That's hard to say. Like I said, I think it's a redemption for, I think to a degree there's a level of, there are people in the world who, are forgotten, who are thrown away, who are pushed aside, and those people can have an effect. You can have a good effect, you can have a bad effect. You can make the right choice, you can make the wrong choice. And I think that this movie does a great job of like showing, Batman, he's making choices to try to do good for people. Catwoman is kind of straddling that line, and Penguin he's doing things that would benefit him and not really anybody else, except for maybe, his close companions. But I mean, I think that this movie does a great job of showing like that mirrored version. We talk about this practically with every Batman film because it's what makes every Batman villain so good for Batman, is that there are versions of characters that so closely come to what Bruce Wayne is or who Batman is, and when you see just a slight change, how much different that character can be. Like there's, the point in the film where he's trying to point out about who his parents were, Penguin's parents are, and he could have been just like Bruce Wayne if his parents didn't throw him away, and he could have grown up and had that silver spoon that Bruce Wayne had and all of that. And it's interesting because it's like that one little situation that changes everything for him. And then when you look at Selina, she has that one situation that changes her from being, this background character who's making coffee for, the company men to she, takes charge of her life because of this situation that happens. And it's always interesting because Batman is that character where that one fateful night changed his life forever, and conveniently there just happens to always be these situations that happen with a lot of Batman villains where it's like one small thing can make a huge difference. And I think this film does a great job of showing the different ways that characters could turn out just because of a unfortunate event that happens to them.
Yeah, I would agree with that in the sense that like it's they all come from the same place of being like disconnected and somewhat isolated from society, but it really is like about the choices like we as viewers can make, based on like the fables of like these three characters who are kind of oscillating around the same idea, but are obviously making different choices and representing like different ideals. I mean, there's also a lot of repressed urges in here too. There's, it's something that's very much prevalent, and it's probably what pissed off parents a lot back in the day in the 90s. With this idea of like Penguin with his very overt like deviancy and like very wanton display of harassing people, I guess, and Catwoman and Batman deal with their own like repressed urges in their own way, much more like toned down and subdued, but definitely there and very in your face. But to move on to the last section, I feel like this is something, BJ, you might appreciate. And a section I call The Legacy We Leave Behind for Chip. And really, I wanted to point out something that in this universe, Penguin refers to Chip as Gotham's favorite son. So clearly Bruce Wayne is not that. But the question I have for the group is, what's Chip's deal?
Chip, he's a legend. Hashtag Chip to TPU. That's what we need. We need to get Chip on this podcast. That's his deal. But I don't know what his deal is. He's definitely he enjoys being the favorite son of the city, where he's up there right next to his dad at that one press conference that we see. And he's the one that Penguin wants the most. He doesn't even want Max Shrek. So he's definitely, I'm sure he's a guy who enjoys the nightlife. He enjoys the money, and I think that's his whole backstory. He's just a rich brat.
I don't disagree. I think that it almost feels like there's obviously a plot point that takes place where Penguin's after the firstborns and all of that because of how everything that happened with him. However, the one thing that's odd about this is that the actor who plays Chip and the lack of like kind of like fleshing out the character or doing anything to make the character somebody that you care about or don't care about or anything like that makes it feel like somebody just said, hey, we need to cast this actor because he's the nephew of so-and-so and we need to get him in the film. He's not going to have a very big role, but we need him to at least be on screen for X amount of minutes. That's how it feels. I mean, I'll be honest. There's not a lot there. I don't know what the deal with Chip is. They kind of waif back and forth between the purpose of him and then there is no purpose for him later on. So like, it doesn't make a lot of sense. It feels like it was something that was just like placed in for the sheer fact of just needing to be there for some unknown, determined reason.
I will posit this. You're right. He's kind of like all over the place. Like he sacrifices himself to save his father early on. Near the end, Max obviously stands in for Chip's place when Penguin goes to abduct him. But otherwise, he's just kind of standing around and he's just kind of aloof and just feels like he's out of it. Even when Penguin goes to try to abduct him, Chip's responses are they don't feel like they're jiving with the moment or he really understands the gravity of what's going on. But I will posit this idea. Perhaps Chip is the blank canvas for our protagonist. He is the soul of Gotham City that our protagonists are forcing their crises upon.
Okay. That's one way to go with it.
We saw the Red Triangle Circus game finally make its way into comics. I think it's time for Chip and Max to make their way into comics.
There we go. We'll tell Chip Zdarsky to
there you go.
Bring his fellow man in.
Yeah. All right, so with that is going to wrap up our conversation for Batman Returns. If you'd like us to talk more things about Batman Returns, I mean, there's a lot of different topics that were pitched about as far as like what we could talk about. There was all kinds of different things. We could have talked about the cultural response, the Super Nintendo video game, the toys. There's a lot of different items that we could touch on, and I know some of us would love to touch on some of those more than others, but if there's a topic specifically related to Batman Returns you guys like us to discuss, let us know. Leave us a comment in the comment section or on YouTube, or send us an email at tbu@thebatmanuniverse.net. With all that being said, be sure to check out our website for all kinds of news, reviews, original content, and other podcasts that we have to offer related to movies, television, video games, news, and everything else related to the Bat fandom. In addition to that, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, Discord. All of our social links can be found over at the website, thebatmanuniverse.net, at the top of the page. You can get in touch with us, as I mentioned, at tbu@thebatmanuniverse.net. Submit some other ideas of things you'd like us to discuss in the future. We're always interested in hearing other topics. We have a couple of topics here that we're trying to basically see if they're going to be something that we can actually, make a good episode about. But we have some ideas for some interesting content here in the near future. But we're always open to more ideas, so be sure to shoot those over. With all of that being said, that is going to wrap everything up for this episode. For BJ, Scott, and myself, thank you so much for listening to the TBU podcast, and we'll see you guys next time.